Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Michelle DiMarzo, the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to another edition of Art in Focus. This month, unusually, we are not doing an in-person complement to the virtual program, in part because the month is getting split up by Fairfield University students going on spring break. So we have taken the opportunity to once again choose an object as the subject of our art in focus that would be a little bit more challenging to do in person. So this is an object that is in fact on view in the Bellarmine Hall galleries at Fairfield University. If you're local, you want to come and stop by. We're open Tuesday through Saturday, 11 to 4. If you walk into our Bellarmine Hall galleries, you would find this in a print case in our main gallery on sort of the top, sitting on the top. But as you might be able to tell from the inches, the dimensions that are listed in the caption, this is a very small object. So I think it would be nearly impossible to have a fruitful conversation in front of it without the aid of, let's say, a magnifying glass or some quite blown up illustrations of the piece. Because in contrast to its actual size, so less than an inch in both directions, the image that you're seeing on screen is vastly blown up. But we are looking at a piece from around 1790 to 1800, attributed to Josiah Wedgwood, the famous potter from England. And we just gave it the title, The Anti-Slavery Seal. It's black basalt. And it was a gift that came to us just last year from a pair of local collectors, Benjamin Ortiz and Victor P. Torchia. So we were very grateful to them for donating this to the museum. There's the picture I went into the gallery and took yesterday. So I said in the title that this piece is called the Anti-Slavery Seal. And I find that the digital photograph on the left plays havoc with my eyes in trying to understand this as a three-dimensional object. And I had to go into the gallery yesterday as I was preparing this presentation. I had to go into the gallery and really stare at it through the plexiglass to remind myself that it is three-dimensional, but three-dimensional and an intaglio seal. Intaglio, if you're not familiar with the vocabulary word, means something that is incised in. I think of it as coming from the Italian because I know Italian. To cut is tagliere, but I'm sure it originally comes from the Latin. I just don't know the original Latin root. Nonetheless, an intaglio is something that has been cut into a surface, as opposed, for example, to something that is in relief, that pushes out from a flat surface. So our seal is an image that is impressed, that is cut into this small black piece of material. But it's very difficult, I think, to perceive that from the photograph on the left. On the right, the angled photograph that I took in the gallery yesterday does give you a little bit of a sense of a sort of a hollowed out cavity. If we look at the torso of this individual, for example, the way we see the light striking it, you might be able to perceive it better as something that has been hollowed out of the surface. But every time I look at that picture on the left, I'm thinking, doesn't it look like his bicep is pushing out from the surface? It's a trick of the eye. So once again, we struggle with the great gifts that technology can give us in allowing us to have this conversation virtually across time and perhaps space, since we put these recordings on our YouTube channel after the fact. But also we lose some of the immediacy that we would have if we were standing in the galleries and talking about this in person. The eagle-eyed who are looking at the seal on the left, the large blown up image, might notice a few things about it. You might notice that it is in reverse, and it's easiest to see this by the lettering that is arranged around sort of the top half of this small oval, that it is not proceeding from left to right, but in fact right to left, which might be an indication, if you didn't have any other context for what a seal might be for, something cut into the surface like this, it might be an indication to you that this is an object designed to create something else. So we've put it in our museum as an art object on its own, grateful for the gift of it from Ben Ortiz and his partner. And yet it is something that's sort of a waypoint in terms of creating something else, a negative intended to produce a positive. So if you can imagine taking, for example, a little soft amount of wax, the way they used to seal letters back in the day, and we took this little intaglio seal and we pressed it onto our soft wax. The resulting positive impression would look like this. And this, in fact, is not we didn't actually test this yet. I just said to the museum director yesterday that wouldn't it be great to actually, do that, which will make the museum registrar get very, very nervous. This is just a digital flipping of the actual object itself. I will show you in a moment an example of this type of image in a positive, in relief example. But this is just to help us focus our eyes a little bit easier without getting distracted by the fact that on the actual object, the words are backwards, designed to produce this positive result that we're looking at here. That's not the only thing that's a little bit strange about this object. Again, very, very small. This would be difficult to see in person. In fact, when I was showing the museum director this yesterday, I was blowing it up on my phone and she wasn't believing me that it was what I was seeing was on this particular piece until I had blown it up enough that she could see what I was pointing out. And it's something to do with this figure. So we have a very small black oval medallion. There is a kneeling African figure. He's chained at the wrists. We can see that there are two looping chains. They come down over his bent left knee. They fall around his kneeling right knee and continue on to the ground. And then we can follow them behind his body to where he is also cuffed at the ankles. So we're looking at a figure, he's mostly nude. We can see the curvature of, as I said before, his biceps, which even in the Intaglio seal really have this trick of the eye of seeming to come out at you. We can see his bare abdomen. There's a hint of drapery tied around his waist, so he's not fully nude. But it's the cuffs on the ankles. If you look there, think about something that does not make sense about this composition. We have an African figure kneeling. The chains come down over his bent front leg and then go back to not 1 but 2 feet. So there is a flaw in our seal, in our art object. There should not be 2 separate feet with cuffs attached to them behind this figure because one of his feet is bent in front. That is one of the mysteries, the things we find interesting about this particular object. The other, so one part of it is that clearly there's a flaw in it. So that makes us interested. How did that flaw happen in the production process? Wouldn't this have been cast off or destroyed if someone noticed that it was flawed? The other thing that we have in the museum have found very interesting in doing research on this object, which I mentioned only arrived to us last year, is that thus far we have not been able to identify another example of an intaglio seal of this composition. So those of you who may have a little bit more familiarity with the subject matter might recognize what we are looking at as an extremely famous visual image. The motto going around the outside, "Am I not a man and a brother?" combined with the image of this chained, kneeling African individual and the name Josiah Wedgwood might put you in mind of, oh, and this is going to do this again. Did this to me before. We're going to wait and see if that image decides to cooperate at the left. But in the interim, you're seeing that same image at the lower right that became a very prominent symbol of the abolition of slavery in England at the end of the 18th and early 19th centuries. And Josiah Wedgwood, most famous for being this incredible potter and entrepreneur in his massive pottery factory, jasperware, those beautiful designs. He is perhaps best known beyond just his pottery for designing the medallion, the anti-slavery medallion that bore this image. And I'm seeing if it's going to cooperate with me in any way. And because it doesn't seem, I'm going to do something very bold. And I'm just going to look up the Metropolitan Museum's, anti-slavery seal. This is very scientific what you're watching me do here. We're going to find this photograph, which is the one that I was trying to include in my slideshow, but that's okay. Technological mishaps happen. Let me bring it up a little bit larger on screen before I go back to my slideshow so you have a chance of seeing this is the famous image. right? This is the one you may have encountered in other contexts that became the symbol of the abolitionist society. And we are able to see in this version with this white background and this black basalt figure, much more clearly the figure itself, right? So we're no longer looking at a negative, something that has been carved in. This pushes forward. So we see the motto around the exterior, we see the figure chained. Note that this one's a little bit tilted in the frame that it is in. And you'll notice that this one only has 1 foot kneeling behind him. So it's very clear that ours is an aberration from the model. But this is the most famous example of this piece. And what has been interesting to us is that you can find thousands of examples of the Josiah Wedgwood anti-slavery medallion in varying sizes, materials, colors, all made starting in the 1780s, because they distributed them hugely widely. Some of them were sold, but a lot of them were donated by Wedgwood freely at abolitionist meetings. So it's an object that was designed to be used for a political purpose to spread the message of the abolition of slavery. And I had written down in my notes that in 1788, so just a year after the first one was created, Wedgwood sent a whole shipment of medallions like this one to Ben Franklin in the United States of America. And Franklin wrote back to him in appreciation of this gift, quote, "I am persuaded that the medallion may have an effect equal to that of the best written pamphlet in procuring favor to those oppressed people." So the oppressed people that Franklin is writing about are the enslaved African individuals that the Abolitionist Society in England was seeking to free. And in fact, the abolitionist efforts were successful. Slavery ended in England in 1804, but did not end in the British colonies outside Great Britain, or rather outside England itself, didn't end there until, I believe, 1837. So there was a disparity in when they ended slavery on English soil and then elsewhere in their colonies. So I'm going to go back to my slideshow where, oh, is it going to? No, and it's gone back to being pixelated. That's okay, but this was the comparison that I wanted to show. And I'd made mention that ours, I'm going to move forward back to our piece, and you'll notice I'm showing it again in its original reversed text form where it's cut into the surface. There are so many examples of the medallion. We haven't found any other examples of an intaglio seal bearing this image. So I'm putting this out there to anyone who may be watching this. If you are familiar in another museum collection with a seal like ours, please let us know, because we would love to know about it. And we would especially like to know, are there any others out there that have that mistake, that have that doubling of the foot behind this figure? So when they say it's an academic question, we're interested in knowing more. If you might be the person who knows more, please feel free to come and share. To go back for a second to the more famous version, that is the anti-slavery medallion, one of the ways that it became so broadly shared and spread was that it became not just a political issue, but it was a fashion issue. So not necessarily the example that's in the Metropolitan, which is encased in a little gold frame that's designed to help it stand up in a case. But if you visit museums and you see other examples of Wedgwood's medallion, you often see it designed to hang on a necklace, to be affixed like a brooch to clothes. And that was one way the abolitionists found of spreading their message. And you'll often find museum curators making reference to a long tradition of wearing political badges and buttons that goes back a very long way, that Wedgwood's use of this image to spread the message of abolition of slavery was part of this heritage, and it's something that we are still participating in today. So for example, I got this from our library on campus a few days ago. Someone might be wearing this affixed to their backpack or to their sweater as a sign of support for the Black Lives Matter movement. We are seeing a continuing tradition of this kind of political slogan. You'll note, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement using only text. Wedgwood and his colleagues relied on the power of an image. But I would like to note that this image that we're looking at, this kneeling African enslaved individual, chains on his wrists and on his ankles, surrounded by this sort of pity-inducing slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" it's been pointed out that while this reflected very much the attitude of white English people of this time, sort of taking pity on the enslaved to advocate for their freedom, you can't deny also that the Black figure that is shown here is in a subject position, is in a position of being less than, having to apply and beg for freedom from those who are in power, who are looking at it, who are wearing the badge, who are sharing it, who are all white. So we notice that and we acknowledge it as part of its history, that it is not a celebration, for example, of an African individual's independence or human rights. It's just a plea, it's a begging for recognition as a fellow human being. So no surprise you would not find that same image being used, for example, in a contemporary campaign, right? We have other ways of communicating now that are more suited to how we understand these relationships in 2022. Or maybe you disagree, maybe you have a different point of view. And if you do, I'd be delighted for you to share your comments or your response in the text box, in the chat box, or you can always send them to me by email after our conversation. But I also wanted to show, in relationship to our tiny little seal, an art object, an art project, I might say, that we have acquired in the same year, and the two acquisitions were related. I'm pretty sure actually the Visani was first, but I'm going back to our caption here. Nope, looks like sorry, we got the donation of this seal first before we bought the Visani. So this is a contemporary Black artist, Roberto Visani. The title of the piece is called Cardboard Slave Kit, Abolitionist Blend DIY. And the picture you're seeing is after assembly. The project dates from 2021. It is cardboard. And it is something that we do not have in our museum in the form that you're seeing it in this photograph. So here's another case of technological or digital trickery. You're seeing on the left the artist's photograph of what this project looks like after you assemble it. But when you purchase it as a museum, which we did in 2021, what you actually receive are the pieces of the 3D printed cardboard, or the computer designed and cut pieces of cardboard, and a set of instructions on the assembly of the sculpture. So the DIY in the title of this piece implies the person who buys it, the museum, the institution, the collector, it's on you to put it together. So it's partially a conceptual art piece in addition to being a physical artifact. We have the pieces, we have we actually got #1 in this series. We were very delighted to see on the certificate that the artist signed. We have not yet assembled it. And in part because we are looking ahead to an opportunity of collaborating potentially with Fairfield University students, for example, who might want to participate in putting this object together. But we also want to make sure that it's presented with the kind of context of, if you didn't know what this figure is connected to, if you had no sense of its relationship to this visual history and the way that the visual history of, that's that same Metropolitan Museum medallion, that's okay, I'll go backward. If you had no idea of this image, its history, the way it has been placed in context and critiqued in our modern time for what we might read it as now, as opposed to the time in which it was created, we want to make sure we can provide that fullness of context, because otherwise, what are we actually seeing? We might debate whether we would recognize this figure as an enslaved Black person or not, depending on the color of the cardboard, for example. We might not understand the context in which it stands or in which it exists. Why is a Black artist choosing this particular piece as the subject of his conceptual project? And what would be the most awesome is if we could get Roberto Visani to talk to Fairfield University students about his ideas behind the project. So all of that is sort of still to come, but the acquisition of this piece was one of the first purchases we made with the museum's Black Art Fund, which we created in 2020 following the George Floyd protests after the murder of George Floyd, in part from a recognition from ourselves as a museum that aside from a few wooden masks from West Africa, from Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, that we really had no work by African or Black American artists, and especially no work by contemporary Black artists. So artists who are living and working now for whom being collected by museums, even one as small and humble as our own, that's an important part of aiding their career. So we decided to establish a fund of our extremely meager extra funding for acquisitions, which we really don't have a line item in our budget for acquisitions. But we decided to make this known and say that we are looking for donations of museum quality work by Black artists and also funding to purchase more. So this is one of our initial purchases last year. We've made a couple so far. We are looking forward to purchasing more. If you have ideas on that, ideas on things you think the Fairfield University Art Museum should be looking to collect, we want to hear from our community about that as well. So please feel free to send us an email, send us your ideas, or if you have artwork that you want to see housed at Fairfield, again, please reach out and let us know. And the last thing that I wanted to share is just a note about a lecture we have coming up next week that might be of interest to some of the people who are watching. If you have not been to Fairfield recently, you really have to come and check out our fantastic show of artwork photography by the Black photographer Adger Cowens. It's Adger Cowens' Sense and Sensibility, and it's a retrospective of 40 years of his extraordinary career. And it was curated by Halima Taha, who is an independent curator and art historian. And she is coming to Fairfield next week on Wednesday, and she's going to be giving a lecture on collecting Black visual culture and the market. It doesn't say it on the flyer because this is a flyer we made for campus. It will be streamed on thequicklive.com at 5 p.m. next Wednesday. So you can sign up on our Eventbrite page for a reminder for that event. And as always, if you have any questions or responses or observations about the object of today's Art in Focus, we encourage you to reach out and share them with us. And thank you for tuning in. We will see you next time.